All right, welcome to those of you continuing to join us for the Climate Strong Islands Pacific Finance webinar. And if you would, we would love to know, as Mickey just put in the chat, if you could introduce yourself, share your name, the organization you represent, and where you're zooming in from, as well as what you are most interested to hear about tonight coming into the webinar. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started as we have a lot of great information to share tonight from three women who are leaders within our Climate Strong Islands network. As some of you may know, the Climate Strong Islands network is a project of the Ocean Foundation that is volunteer-led by island leaders working on community resilience projects with their local communities. The organization has been around for 4 years, and we work across US states and territories with local island leaders in 3 ways. One is to provide education and advocacy within Washington, D.C., and provide those local island leaders direct access to elected and appointed officials within Washington. Secondly, the network was created also to help islanders connect with each other across vast geographies, share learnings, share challenges, and also problem solve together. And then thirdly, the network was created to ensure that local resources, be they financial or knowledge-based, could be driven directly to local organizations, and that CSIN would fundraise for those activities and make sure that we were supporting that exchange of resources. So with that, we have a 10-member steering committee. You can find out more about those amazing folks on our website at climatestrongislands.org. With me tonight are Tina Sablan, Kelley Anderson-Tagarino, and Kate Brown. Tina is the Special Assistant for Climate Policy and Planning and the Senior Policy Advisor for the Office of the Governor in the U.S. Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. She also happens to be one of our co-chairs for the network. So Tina, thank you for joining us this morning in CNMI. Kelley Anderson-Tagarino is the Sea Grant Extension Agent at the University of Hawaii Sea Grant College Program in American Samoa. And Kelley is one of our most active members as part of our policy subcommittee. So Kelley, thank you for joining us this morning in American Samoa. And Kate Brown is the Executive Director of the Global Island Partnership, a global or nonprofit organization. Kate happens to be based out of New Zealand, but her organization represents islands worldwide and has an incredible tenure and one that we learn from every day and really help inspire our domestic network. So we're so pleased to have these 3 women with us tonight, 3 leaders on their specific islands, but certainly within a broader global context as well. And how this webinar came to be was really through a great conversation that was generated through our policy subcommittee. As you may know, the Climate Strong Islands Network has 3 subcommittees that focus on specific aspects of our mission, one being policy. And so Kelley brought to the fore some challenges she was facing with driving financial resources from the federal government to local projects in American Samoa. That then spurred a greater conversation that Tina participated in around just making sure that islands across the Pacific, and specifically US territories, were able to receive many of the federal dollars that have been promised, in essence, to those geographies, let alone for specific topical projects dealing with climate resilience that local islanders are working on, and some of the barriers for getting those resources to those local projects for planning, implementation, and beyond. So with that, we thought, and we actually have gathered from past conversations in our network, during these webinars, during our twice yearly calls, that those two examples are not alone. Many of you are dealing with similar challenges, and I know that's why many of you are joining us either this morning or this evening if you're in Washington, D.C. on the East Coast. So without further ado, I would love for Tina to kick us off and share some of her thoughts and observations as she's wrestled with this topic. From there, we're going to have Kelley talk about some of her challenges that she's faced and also opportunities. And then Kate is going to wrap us up with some of her observations on this as well, coming both from working in a domestic context within the Obama administration, but then also as a global leader on this. We are then going to turn it over to you. We would love for you to pop questions or comments in the chat so that we can have more of a discussion in the latter part of our call. So, Tina, if you could kick us off and give us a little bit of your thoughts on this topic, that would be great.
Thank you, Liz, and Hafaday, and good morning, everyone from Saipan in the Northern Mariana Islands. I'm so happy to be joining this important conversation. And just for some greater context about my background, in addition to serving as the Special Assistant for Climate Policy and Planning and as co-chair for the Climate Strong Islands Network, I also co-chair the CNMI's Green Growth Initiative Working Group, and I'm a board member for two conservation nonprofits here in the Marianas, the Friends of the Mariana Trench and the Tano Tasi and Todu. And so I'm happy to share my perspective on the challenges and opportunities that we see in the territories in terms of driving funding to the local level and to ensure that that these federal investments are actually making it to communities and that we're seeing the benefits that were promised. And then I'd love to hear from my colleagues on this panel and everybody else that's joining us today about the challenges and opportunities that you're seeing in your own island communities. I guess I wanted to start by noting how much of a difference the Biden administration's attention to environmental justice and making investments in historically underserved communities has just how much of a difference that we've seen. It's refreshing for one, but it's also helped bring to light some of the unique and systemic challenges in addressing these issues and in really driving these investments to America's small island territories. And so I guess in general, the main challenges that I wanted to talk about today have to do with our resource challenges in terms of grant writing, grant management, and then also implementation across both the nonprofit and government sectors in the Marianas. We recently experienced some pretty deep disappointments when the Solar for All awards were announced and CNMI had put in for that and didn't get any funding. And then when the climate pollution reduction implementation grants were announced and one application in Saipan was awarded, none of the other territories got any funding. And so part of the one of the barriers that we're seeing is that we're competing with bigger, better financed and resourced organizations and states in submitting strong applications for these competitive programs. And then even when funds are awarded, where we're also faced with our real human resource capacity, where our agencies and our nonprofits are already quite strained in terms of managing and implementing the grants and the projects they already have in their portfolio. I'm aware of a coalition of organizations, nonprofits, and agencies. They're preparing an application. They've been working really hard on this for the last few months, really, for the EPA Community Change Grant program. And one of the NGOs here just recently had to withdraw because they just don't have the capacity to take on one more thing. And they recently got awarded another project, which is great. But now it throws this other application for a whole new, it throws a wrench into this other application, basically. And then the other issue that we're seeing in terms of human resources is that we're also competing with the Department of Defense and losing people. You know, when human resources, getting qualified people into these positions in both government and nonprofit, it's already challenging. But in Guam, CNMI now, increasingly we're hearing more and more about you know, people being drawn to higher salaries, and nobody can blame them for that, but it makes things more difficult in the nonprofit and government sector. And then, of course, procurement and supply chain issues. Again, we're competing with bigger organizations, bigger states, and the cost to move supplies and equipment to the islands to implement projects is so much higher, and we don't necessarily get more funding to offset those costs, right? And then lastly, the other issue that has come up in terms of funding is that the Pacific Island territories aren't eligible for the same types of international or regional opportunities or even State Department funded opportunities that our brothers and sisters in the island nations are eligible for. And so there are gaps in these opportunities that are not necessarily closed by federal programs. So that's something that's been on my mind for a while, and I'm interested in having a deeper conversation about how we can address those challenges. And
oh, maybe something's happened to Liz. Oh, there she is. I think you're on mute, Liz.
I'm so sorry, Tina. Please continue on.
Well, I was turning it over to you, Liz, but I could certainly turn it over to Nikki or Kelley or Kate.
No problem. And I am sorry, everyone. There was someone who requested an AI summary, and I should not have pressed OK at that point in time. So my apologies. Tina, thank you so much for sharing those critical challenges that you're facing there on CNMI. And I know that we will hear a bit of similar themes from Kelley, but Kelley, I'm especially interested for you to share with the group, you know, some of the challenges that you have brought to us at CSIN, and two, if you would like to pick up on some of the challenges that Tina laid out as well, or we can save that to discussion. Either way, would love to hear more from you.
Sure. Happy to chat about American Samoa. Talofa, everyone, and I serve as the American Samoa Sea Grant Extension Agent for the American Samoa Community College, which is our only college in American Samoa. And I know people are spread out around the world on this call, so I thought I would give a real brief overview of American Samoa first, for those who may not be familiar. It's the only U.S. territory in the South Pacific, and we have 5 high islands that are inhabited and 2 atolls that are not. And we only have about 76 square miles of land altogether. And we now have only about 47,000 people, and that is down from about 60,000 when I moved here in 2009. I've been living here since 2009, and I've done a few different things, but I've been with Sea Grant in this position since 2013. American Samoa is also the only place in the US where you are not a citizen by birthright. You're a US national, and that is a different special category of humans in the US that is unique to American Samoa. So that alone can cause some challenges for financial opportunities for positions and grants that require US citizens to be the recipient. And in American Samoa, again, being remote and small, it's challenging to get that traction with federal agencies and other groups in the mainland. So I really appreciate having friends like CSIN who help amplify our concerns in these small islands so far away. And some of the things I've noticed over time, I'll start with a story of how local procurement works, which Tina touched on very briefly. So in American Samoa, none of our government agencies have a credit card, not a single one. Everything is purchased with a check that has to go in the mail. A lot of vendors won't accept that. So you end up going through a middleman, and that can add a lot of costs and a lot of delays, of course. The ability to jump on Amazon and buy something, that's not an option for folks here. And so I'm kind of starting more on the ground impacts and working my way up in terms of our financial concerns here. And another fun procurement issue in American Samoa is they love paper. So everything's still on paper. You have to physically drive the pieces of paper around the island. So those are areas that could be improved, but a lot of the other issues we don't have much control over. And within American Samoa, most of the agencies are high-risk grantee status due to some past issue, which was often driven by infrastructure or human resource lacking, inability to get reports submitted properly or other issues, and those impacts linger till today. So if you're a high-risk grantee, that means that your grants are all going to be reimbursable. And even if you aren't considered high-risk grantee status, a lot of the current funding streams for resilience, for underserved, marginalized communities, they're all reimbursable. All the IRA and BIL streams of money coming down, reimbursable. So Tina mentioned the Changemaker grant, which is about 10 to 20 million. I believe they even removed the cap for that. No one in American Samoa can manage a 10 to $20 million grant that's a reimbursable basis. That's just not going to happen. When I started asking around in American Samoa about that grant opportunity, I was hoping people would apply, and I was going to offer to partner with them because of my position within University of Hawaii. We can serve as a fiscal host, and then through sub-awards, we can provide money up front. And so that's one of the benefits of being connected to a bigger institution. And unsurprisingly, nobody was applying because they can't manage those floats. It's just not possible here. And while I echo Tina's joy about increased support for island communities, it isn't actually very helpful if it's all in a reimbursable basis. Other challenges that affect us in the middle of the Pacific are, Buy America Act. So for example, if we had to follow that to get cement made in America, that can be 5 to 10 times the cost and delay your project by 6 months to a year. So continuing to get waivers for things like that are really meaningful for small remote places like this. And then for financing larger construction efforts, being able to get that money up front is really helpful. And we have a lot of infrastructure needs because we unfortunately have the highest rate of sea level rise anywhere in the US nation or anywhere in the NOAA global tide gauge network. And so we're trying to address those. But again, the challenges with the reimbursable basis funding streams right now make it really difficult to access that money. And we don't have a lot of large nonprofits here. We're trying to grow that sector. A number of my past students have started their own nonprofits, but they're small. They certainly don't have a $10 million float. So I think those are some of the challenges that we have been facing and continue to face. And unfortunately, from the little bit I've understood, There doesn't seem to be much of a workaround in terms of payment upfront on these reimbursable options, but they do offer fairly quick reimbursement. But again, coming back to that human resource challenge, that is challenging for us to do because the reporting and requesting of reimbursements takes time. And so many people here are already stretched so thin. As Tina mentioned, we just don't have the capacity to do these things in-house. So I hope that that's a useful overview for folks of our challenges here. And I think that finding some regional strategic partnerships similar to other islands that have set up trusts to work together could be one pathway for us to come together across US API or within geographic regions to work within our geographic partners with our sisters and brothers to give us more of a float and more capacity so that we can actually use these resources coming from the US. I think I'll leave it there. And if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. Thank you.
Kelley, thank you so much. I think there are some key themes there, Kate, as you enter this conversation that I would be interested for you to explore a little bit if you care to in this segment or in the discussion later. But especially around what Kelley mentioned, this collective action coming together around Pacific Islands in order to address some of these challenges that Tina and Kelley have spoken to. I know we've spoken quite a bit about trusts and private opportunities to fundraise, how those can be leveraged with government dollars and other dollars flowing in to help support these local projects. But yes, would be interested to hear your thoughts coming from Global Island Partnership, but also having intimate knowledge of federal government workings, especially being part of the Obama administration.
Yeah, wow. I think I'm really glad to come after Kelley and Tina, because I think what we're hearing there is the reality of trying to address climate change implementation or any type of implementation in a small island context. And that's where we see there's real connection between other islands, both in the region and in the Pacific region and around the world on issues of size and scale, capacity. It can be really hard to hire people because everyone's gone to regional organizations, to other things that pay better. And so a lot of this work at the more local implementation level is really difficult. And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to have this discussion here is to think about what are some of the solutions. And I think Kelley and Tina touched on some of those, really looking at how islands can work together and what are some examples of where things have worked. So with the US jurisdictions, you've really got the issue of what resources are available to them from the federal government. And there is a lot, but I think one of the things that Climate Strong Islands Network has really been trying to do is think about how it's appropriate to the places where it's going. And so there has been some advocacy around that issue. And then the second thing is, how do these islands work with other islands in region? Because the impacts of climate change are not kind of coming up to someone's border and saying, well, they have access to US resources, etc. And as you can hear from Kelley in particular, while there is access to resources, the ability to actually get them is challenged. And I think that is actually a very similar problem that the countries and the independent countries in the region have in trying to get funds from places like the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund. And there's been a lot of work done to look at how to make it easier for those islands to actually access finance. I think the other thing that is becoming clearer, I was just at Climate Week in New York, is that at the moment, there's a lot of attention on climate addressing climate issues and finance in the islands. But we're heading towards a point where the impacts of climate change are going to be so big on places like the United States, and we can see that in Florida, and in Georgia and the Carolinas, and just being hit and hit and hit and hit, that it will be really difficult for islands, I believe, to continue to try and access resources. So we've got to think really smartly about how do we create the space at island level, whether it's looking at how you work between islands on some of these things like trust funds. And there has been some real success in places. But what we find, for example, in Micronesia, both with the Micronesia Challenge and the Micronesia Conservation Trust, is that it's more challenging for the territories to be engaged in the US jurisdictions to be engaged just from a resource perspective in those regional trust funds and others. And then we also see in some places like Niue where they've tried to, just deal with their constraints around size of only having 1,500 people on that island to create their own kind of mechanism with the Niue Oceanwide Trust and their conservation commitment approach. So that's kind of taking an approach that tries to work for the island. And I think what we have to do in this space is really start to think about some of those things, because we know also, even if we're looking at countries, that implementation happens both at national level but also at local level. So how do we have the infrastructure in terms of local organizations, local community organizations and others that have the ability and the capacity to actually receive resources and do all of the things that you need to do around reporting, etc. Like, how can we set up something that's actually trying to help that? And where are there good examples of that? There are some good examples that we've seen through NGOs working, kind of global NGOs working in regions, looking at how they can backstop local organizations with some of these processes and approaches. On the procurement issue, that is a huge issue, and I think it's something that Climate Strong Islands Network could actually help think about what some of the solutions are from an external perspective, rather than just kind of being left to American Samoa to figure out on itself. But I think, like so many issues on finance, this needs a collaborative approach, not individual organizations and individual islands trying to solve the problem by themselves. And it really needs us to look at what are all the different approaches that are going on. Just last week or the week before in Brussels in Europe, there was a week-long meeting of European overseas countries and territories and UK overseas territories discussing their ability to access climate finance because of some of the same issues that we're talking about here. Some of it is that they just don't have anything that they can access. I think in the UK territories, we see that very much. And so it's looking at the reality that the impacts are growing. And as we can hear from Kelley, in terms of sea level rise, one of the most impacted places, but their ability to actually do anything about it is, in fact, becoming even more limited, I believe. And so we've got to think about what are some approaches that can actually work in the US jurisdictions, whether that's both working together, but also working with other non-US islands to actually help this. And we see things like in the French government in the Pacific has had a long set of funding around regional cooperation between its territories and other territories. So even thinking about some things like that, how can you learn from each other rather than kind of just have parts of the region not able to fully implement actions to both build resilience, but also to deal with climate change impacts and all the other things that are also coming down the pike. So I think we've got a huge what we're really doing here is identifying what some of the problems are, and now we need to think about what are some of the solutions to this, because we see this in the island space forever and ever. It is once we put our heads together, we can solve some of these things, and we can kind of come up with new ideas and new initiatives that can help. For our organization, which is a global organization, but quite small, we're actually fiscally hosted by by an organization based in Ireland, and have a really clear sense of some of the challenges around both becoming a legal entity and those types of things. And I think we heard that talked about a little bit. So there may be opportunities to kind of really think about what are the right approaches in island spaces. And on the trust funds, I think there's real appetite in national trust funds and more specific trust funds to try and create something that can help move resources to the places it needs to be. And so we see we're in GLISPA just starting next week, we're launching a new initiative on conservation trust funds, a community of practice focused on small island developing states, because that's where there's a lot of effort on that at the moment, but it doesn't mean that others couldn't be engaged. And looking at kind of what are the lessons we learn, how do you actually build something that's robust and that can be funded? And then it's looking as well at the funding pipeline, whether it's from domestic resources or other resources that can be mobilized into these trust funds. I think the biggest thing with a trust fund is really about the word trust. And so in a place like American Samoa that's challenged in terms of how its grants are going, a trust fund is going to be a challenge, just on the trust side of the trust fund. So thinking a little bit about how we might solve that problem, I think, is really important. So thanks, Liz.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. There are so many threads to pick up on here, and I think, Kate, you helped pivot the direction of this discussion in a really wonderful way, in that as much as we are sharing challenges at the start of this webinar, we also wanted to delve into some of the solutions that we know, as Kate mentioned, through European overseas territories and UK overseas territories, the French Pacific strategy that she mentioned, other relatives of US islands, especially in the Pacific, that are testing out different models and trying to think about what the sustainability of their funding is going to be going forward. So thank you for mentioning those. I think we also wanted to get into a little bit of a conversation, both in terms of Tina, Kelley, and Kate's reflections on solutions that they've been thinking of, but then also, as Nikki put in the chat, we would love to hear from our audience. And if you want to put questions in the chat or comments in the chat, or if you want to just raise your hand, I'd be happy to weave your questions into the conversation or your comments into the conversation. Because I know we have a couple people who are really just working in the US, others who are working globally, some working specifically on very key components of this issue. And so, yes, this is an opportunity for you to share some of your knowledge or share some of your questions that may have come up. I think I'd like to kick off this segment. And again, for those of you joining us, this is a kind of a special webinar for the Climate Strong Islands Network around our pillar of knowledge sharing. As I think some of you who joined at the beginning know, but some of you who joined midway through the conversation may not, Climate Strong Islands Network is just focused on US related islands. So whether that's islands affiliated with states or territories, this is an initiative that started 4 years ago to help support local island leaders as they combat climate change, as they're on the front lines, but also support the climate resilience work that they've been doing for many years and are continuing to do, coming up with innovative strategies that are helping to inform, frankly, the climate policy throughout the United States. So with that, I would love to pick up on this thread of a collaborative approach, and especially given that I think what was eye-opening when I first heard Kelley explain some of the technical challenges around just governance and how money flows through American Samoa, the kind of the unique status that that you have because you are in, just a different governance structure than, say, CNMI, and then certainly, the Hawaiian Islands, et cetera. So in terms of thinking about just structure and changes within that, I would be interested to kind of think about, and Kelley, if you want to discuss some of the things that you have tried to do to circumvent some of those structural challenges, but also really touch on what could be done if, for instance, we were in DC right now. I'm so sorry. Internet is cutting out again. We do live across from Homeland Security, so at times the internet cuts out. Not sure what that's about. So sorry, right back in the conversation here. So that is all to say, I would just be interested, Kelley and Tina, Kate, of course, just if you could touch on, if you had an ask of your representative right now around some of the things that could be changed without major legislation change or structural governance change. If you just want to share some of those things that you think, wow, this could be a solution, this could be a path forward.
Sure. I think some areas that hopefully wouldn't require major legislation would be making allowances that grants don't have to be fully reimbursable. You could actually provide, say, 6 months of the anticipated year's budget at the front side. And maybe the agency funding it could just provide a credit card only for purchases on the grant. I don't know if that would require legislation, but it sounds like a reasonable approach to provide funding up front. And then one way that I've sort of made my own path towards that is just leveraging University of Hawaii's resources to do that. We did deal with some liability changes in policy this year, which I'm told were partially driven by the Lahaina fires, which made it impossible for me to do contractual service agreements, but we can still do subawards. And so I just requested approval to continue providing the 50 to 75% of the funding upfront, depending upon the length of the project. And so that's what's allowed us, for example, me being based at the community college here, they're under fiscal duress. They have zero float. So if the money's not physically in the account, they can't cut that check. And so getting the money here into the account at the start of the project is key. And I've made that work here. I feel like it could be done in other places as well.
Great, thank you for that. Tina, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I like to echo what Kelley said about the federal agencies allowing for advances in funds. And I wanted to know, like, one agency in particular actually does, at least here in CNMI. I'm fairly sure that we are also a high-risk grantee, as American Samoa is, but EPA does allow advances in funds and also very quick turnaround times for drawdowns. And EPA is actually doing some other interesting things in the community change and the Changemaker grant programs. So they're providing technical assistance that includes grant writing assistance for applicants. There's the opportunity to, they're accepting applications on a rolling basis through mid-November. If you're not funded the first time you submit, there's the opportunity to resubmit. There's even the opportunity to make an oral presentation to pitch your project if maybe the writing of the application isn't the strongest, right? There's also that chance to, gain points and submit a stronger overall application. And then with the Changemaker grant program, so my understanding is that a group of bigger philanthropic organizations has been selected to distribute millions of dollars in smaller grants to community-based organizations, at least around Region 9, including the Pacific Territories. And and so there's a lot more flexibility for smaller organizations that would be applying for these smaller grants through that program. And so in addition to requesting for advances in funds, I would ask our representative to consider including these, these accommodations, I guess, across the federal family and programs like that. So we, with the Pacific Territories, do have a BABA waiver but not across all of the federal agencies. It doesn't apply to the Virgin Islands, which I think could probably also use that support. And then if there are, wherever there are local matches required, to consider at least affording the opportunity to seek waivers of those local matches, because that can also be quite burdensome to small island territories to meet.
Thank you, Tina. Kate, any thoughts before we continue on in this thread of conversation?
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that there's an opportunity for Climate Strong Islands Network to kind of capture some of the good practices, lessons learned, and reflect them in both to agencies, but also to in your work on more looking at what bills and things are going through, because I think and with Congress, because I think that will be helpful, like making those connections a little bit more about what is working well and what is a challenge, because I think that's a reality that we have to face. And I see a lot with non-independent countries that often they kind of get non-independent islands often get forgotten in or just kind of seen as quite small, even by the countries that they're a part of. So, the voice sometimes isn't as strong as it could be. And I think that's where, working together will be really powerful. For us in Gillespie, actually, as we were looking at trying to become a legal entity, which is some of the things that people in these places are doing, we're actually getting help from an organization in Puerto Rico that is part of this network because they've gone through this process a lot. So that's really helpful. So sort of looking at where are kind of the people that can actually who have got these ideas. But I would also suggest that maybe this is a subgroup area of Climate Strong Islands Network, really looking at how do you address some of these challenges, and are there organizations already in existence in the network who can help backstop some of the things that are going on, or even how you look at capacity in a regional or interregional way, which is very common in the Pacific anyway, sort of looking at how you deal with things, not just building all of the capacity in one place, but across places. I think, there's also the big US jurisdictions like Hawaii in the region and Guam, and what role can they play to both be an advocate for what you guys are talking about, but also to be a backstopper, more of a help than their institutions might be right now. And I know that there are issues also with that, but I think that's some of the places I would look as kind of how do we kind of get them engaged in the right way as well, particularly because they're, if you look at places like the University of Hawaii are building a lot of the capacity back into the region, or the University of Guam, for example. And I wonder then as well how people like University of Guam can build some of this into what they're doing. I mean, I see a real opportunity for institutions that are multi-island to be very supportive and help with some of the capacity challenges. I know that there's a lot of other inherent issues in that, definitely. And even places like SPREP and the other regional agencies that are in the region to really challenge them a lot more. I will say this because I used to work at SPREP, but SBC, SPREP, and others, which your islands are members of, but to challenge them much more to help you break the barriers around the finance side of things, and in a way that makes sense for where you are, both in terms of supporting local organizations and some of the challenges that you've talked about here. What role can they have in helping?
Great points at all three of you, and especially, I guess I want to tie one of the responses in the chat from Terrence Hay Eddy, who's from UNDP, and just put a resource in around the Path to Scale report that USAID Localization of Funds program launched during Climate Week, just, well, a month ago now, hard to believe. But I see that, and I just note that I think what has been very interesting about this conversation too is two resources that we have through the network. And I would encourage, oh, great, Terrence, you're on there. I'm going to call on you in a minute here. But for those of you who don't know, we do have a national islands policy framework that was shaped at the start of the network that is really our guide toward policy and how we show up on the Hill and in federal agencies. We do a fly-in once a year with our steering committee and other policy subcommittee members so that we can push issues and especially legislation that either we're helping to co-write or provide the bill text for. I know Nora Carlos is on this call, and she is one of our policy consultants through High Street Strategies. So I would say if you're not familiar with that document and you want to take a look at it, we are also, Mickey just popped the link in the chat. We are always looking for feedback, and we are in the midst of revamping it as we get ready for a next administration. So I put a plug in for that because you touched on that policy aspect, Kate, and kind of understanding what's moving, what's not, what we need to inspire language around, where we need to insert an island voice. Second is we do have another subcommittee on fundraising and development. And if any of you are interested to find out more or becoming a member of the network, it is free, it is voluntary, and we are always looking for people who really have deep knowledge and are working on the ground on these issues, and especially around resource gathering and then deployment. So I put a plug in for that too. I'm the network facilitator. Mickey will put my email in at the end if you want to get in touch with me directly on that issue. Terrence, would love to hear any thoughts you have, especially since you just put that great link from USAID in the chat. But yeah, any observations or questions, either, if you'd like to share.
Thanks, Liz. So yeah, so I work with the Jeff Small Grants program in UNDP, which has been around for about 2 decades now, and so we were able to expand into a lot of the Jeff eligible SIDS over successive Jeff phases. Kate and I go back a long way. We've been on a lot of Island, Bright Spot, and CLISPR events over the years. So this report that I put in the chat was prepared specifically about USAID policies in relation to Samantha Power's target of 25% for local organizations. And so Jenny Springer, the consultant who worked on that, interviewed a lot of the kind of grant-making organizations out there. So we were included in that. But it's a fairly forensic report on procedures, which some of you probably are much more familiar with than I am, with a bunch of recommendations. In terms of the island voice, I was at the launch event during New York Climate Week. I didn't hear a lot about islands, to be honest, to come to think of it. So it might be worth even reaching out to the authors of that report. Yeah, and then I think there's a 2025 target and a 2030 target to increase further. So these questions of flexibilities and where they would be, what types of USAID type grants can be made. The report has quite a lot of material on that. That's it from my side.
Terrific. Thank you for highlighting that resource and sharing it. Kate.
Oh yeah, hi Terrence, good to see you. I was going to say, so I think the one issue is that these guys are eligible for USAID funds, but the approaches and some of the processes might be really relevant to them. But with a different hat on, which is Local 2030 Islands Network, we will go and follow up with USAID on some of this because that's very interesting. I think I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I think it's a lot around connecting the dots, to be honest, because just from where I sit, so we're hearing this here in this subject area, then we're hearing like what the European overseas are saying, then we're hearing, I was at the SIDS meeting, kind of hearing what the SIDS are saying. We also, in Local 2030 Islands Network, run an interagency group of US federal agencies that work in islands and coordinate with them. And then I see lots of money also going out those doors that aren't going through USAID, aren't going in other things. And then there's also in Congress and other places, Congress people and senators that are really focused on the Pacific. And in that sense, it's the Pacific that's not the US Pacific, it's the Pacific, other Pacific, the independent island Pacific. So it seems to me like trying to connect the dots between all these different things is a really good idea, including kind of a lot of the advocacy that's going on. And what seems like it would make sense in Climate Strong Islands Network is something that's collecting what's working. So that's very tangible and trying to figure out between the institutions what you could actually do, and something that's a little bit more long term, which is trying to change in a kind of longer term way some of the approaches that are being undertaken. And then thinking about asking difficult questions like, are US territories or even islands getting enough resources? Like how as we look at the COP in Baku, that's really focused on finance. So that is a finance COP. There's a lot of advocacy. The Small Island Developing States, through the Alliance of Small Island States, is advocating very strongly for a financial target. Where does that leave the places like the US territories and others that don't have a voice in that discussion other than the main US voice? And I think that in itself is an interesting question that really needs to be asked from an equity, from a justice, from all of the things, but also as places in the same regions who are facing the same issues. And you see that also with Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands. There, when a cyclone hits US Puerto Rico as the main supply chain space for most of those islands, it's making it difficult for everyone everywhere, not just the US parts of the island. So I think there's a big strategy here, but I'm not quite sure what it is.
Well, and to that effect, I think you hit on 2 points that are really critical as we start to close out here, which is, who's going to take on this work of really stitching together and mapping this out. And I think, in a way, Kate, you volunteered GLSFA and CSIN to work together to figure out some of this in order to really start to identify, what are the levers and pulleys and who's part of this ecosystem. Again, Terrence, thank you for bringing up that resource, because I think it really does, to Kate's point, it really does draw attention to where the US is focused outside of itself, and then where it's actually focused on what it can have impact on due to its governance. And Tina, I wanted to highlight, because this is very important, as you said, if I was to ask my legislator today, or I was in, a committee office, this set aside funds for territories, kind of to, going along with Kate's point, really recognizing what territories provide for the US in a number of different aspects, and then recognizing that in how territories are treated in terms of how resources flow to them, how many resources flow to them, and for what. So I really wanted to highlight that, because I know that was an additional comment you had, but like such an important one. And Kate, to your point, as we have many members in Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, they would echo similar sentiments. We're going to start to wrap up here. And sorry, Kate, go.
Oh, just one thing, because I think Terrence, so UNDP's Jeff Small Grants Program, or Small Grants Program, and I can't remember how to say it, Terrence, is actually a GLSFA member also. And we often use them as an example of really trying to localize funds, because the mechanism, so it's not a mechanism that obviously US islands are currently able to attract, but it could be, what you have done before, Terence, is had funds come from like Australia, remember, in the Pacific, that was focused on adaptation as a very specific fund. I think what's interesting about their approach is it's setting up a national decision-making process for prioritizing where funding goes at national level or island level, and then also having a staff in island and dispersing funds to local community organizations. And so very local, very, very local funds. And so there is opportunity also, I think, to learn from some of these types of initiatives that have been going like for 25 years. I think I went to something of that.
Mm. Yeah, just quickly to respond, Kate. So yeah, it's a question of governance, and the word trust you were referring to earlier, that when you transfer that decision-making ability to the national steering committees, which is a mix of government and non-governmental stakeholders, the kind of risk appetite, at least for UNDP, is such that you can actually have a fairly high number of small grants with a direct engagement and monitoring on the ground. So you don't really have to report on rely so much on all these sorts of written reports and things. And definitely a risk appetite for nothing reimbursable. It's very much about pre-financing. And so yeah, I mean, some of those governance questions could be quite applicable to some of the territories for the US or for other parts of the world. And so that some of that we shared with that report I referred to, but there's more to be done, I think, there. And maybe if the opportunity arises somewhere to share those experiences and through your networks, we'd be pleased to do so.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Thank you. As we close out here, Tina, Kelley, any parting words that you would like to share with the audience that we have, and also to note that we'll be sharing this recording more broadly with our network, around 600 contacts that we have both domestically and abroad.
Yeah. So two things. I wanted to mention that within CSIN, there have been conversations about leveraging private philanthropic funds to help close the gaps in opportunities that the island territories cannot apply for. And I'd really be interested in exploring that further in this network. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, just to express my support for something that Kelley called for earlier in her opening, and that's for more strategic partnerships among the island territories, the island communities. As we pursue funding, we could do it together. So even in the instance when there are set aside allocations for territories, for example, we are competing with each other almost all the time, and we have similar interests, similar impacts that we experience, and it just would make more sense, and I think our applications would be stronger if we go in together. So that's my parting thought.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for taking some time to join us in thinking about these topics. And I agree that we shouldn't be competing, Tina. We should be working together. We don't want to be the baby birds in the nest all trying to grab the most for themselves. We want to be supporting one another. And I think, the islands have so much history and knowledge about resilience that I think that we bring a lot of value to the table. I'm from Tampa Bay area of Florida, and seeing people deal with the fallout there, not having been through things that impact remote places severely that last for weeks, months, or more. It just resonates more with me right now that the value islands bring to the table is tremendous. And I think that working together, we can really show our strengths. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Kelley, Tina, Kate, for sharing. Thank you for being part of our network and such strong supporters. Thank you for everyone who joined us on the call, either in the morning in the Pacific or in the evening here on the East Coast of the mainland United States. Again, This is the Climate Strong Islands Network. You can reach us at climatestrongislands.org to find out more information. And we look forward to be in touch with you. And we hope you have a safe and healthy fall. Take care.
Thank you.